We're looking in this study to the first 11 verses of Mark chapter 11. We often refer to these verses as the triumphal entry. Actually, the entry doesn't happen until verse 11, and there's nothing to indicate that there's any kind of note of triumph. Actually, at that point, the triumph comes as he's going up the hill towards the point where he enters. Anyway, let's look at some of the verses. Verse 1. In verse 1, it speaks of what they are doing as they approach Jerusalem. The obvious reading is that this refers to the crowd which had gathered around Jesus in Jericho. This passage now gives us more information about these people. They appear to be pilgrims coming up to Jerusalem for Passover. That makes it look as if Jericho might not have been the first place where these pilgrims identified Jesus and the 12 and tagged along with them. Perhaps they've been with him for longer than that. Bethphage and Bethany, mentioned in this verse, are two villages about an hour's walk out of Jerusalem on the Jericho road. It looks as if Jesus took a break there and waited there while the two disciples carried out their errand. We know that Jesus had contacts in those villages. The sisters Martha and Mary were most obviously, and perhaps they might even have helped set up the contact with the animal. Jericho Road was quite steep as it approached Jerusalem, so the whole company was probably out of breath and needing a break. So stopping for a while in one of those villages was a good idea. Verses 2 and 3. It's possible that Jesus was here using a word of knowledge to get this animal, but I think it's far more likely that he'd set up the arrangement and set up the password. Notice that Mark doesn't actually call the animal a donkey, though Matthew does. Incidentally, Luke never makes any mention of a donkey, even in his account of Joseph and Mary journeying to Bethlehem. Verses 4 to 6. The two disciples perform their errand. A couple of unknown men starting to untie an animal would raise suspicions among the bystanders, and it did. And the fact that they allowed the action once the password had been given suggests that the animal's owner was there and said that everything was okay. Verse 7. As the young animal had never been ridden, it would not have come with its own saddlecloth, so the disciples improvised one with their coats. Another thing to notice is that in all of his travels in and around Galilee, there's never been any mention of Jesus riding on an animal. Well, Shanks's pony was all he rode. If they were about to make the final ascent into Jerusalem, he could pretty much guarantee that he'd be the only rider, because Jewish custom required that at least the final part of that journey must be done on foot. So I imagine that when Jesus got to the city gates, he would have dismounted from the animal and walked into the city as custom required. So by riding up to Jerusalem, Jesus would make the occasion stand out for everyone who knew him, and he would be drawing attention to himself in the eyes of everyone else. The animal he was riding might have been a modest one, but this was a high-profile action. Verse 8. If the crowd contains those who appeared in our story in Jericho, who'd heard that Jesus was addressed as the Son of David, sort of aka Messiah, then his approaching Jerusalem would have seemed to them as a triumphant approach to his capital city. So they turned the road into a royal procession route by putting their clothes on some branches on the road in front of him. The fourth gospel says that most of these branches were of palm trees, which is why we refer to the celebration of this event as Palm Sunday. Now, before we can read any further, we need to do some background work. Prophecy of Zechariah, chapter 9, verse 9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Zechariah was a prophet who spent a lot of his time looking forwards to the time when the Lord would act decisively to rescue his wayward people. In this verse, he's taking the notion of God providing a new king for his people, and he pictures this in terms of a royal entry into Jerusalem. In the generations before Jesus, when the people had centuries of foreign occupation, the idea that such a king might come and put things right was really very popular. As far as most people were concerned, he couldn't come soon enough. They'd even invented a name for him, the Anointed One, which is the Hebrew of which gets into English as the Messiah. I think we have to say that Jesus was deliberately fulfilling this prophecy. He knew he was the promised Messiah, and this action of riding into Jerusalem amounted to a public announcement of who he was. Lots of people would understand it as such. Psalm 118 was the final psalm in a sequence designed for pilgrims going up to Jerusalem, and it's to be expected that the crowd with Jesus would anyway be singing that psalm at this stage. If you look at it in Psalm 118, look at verses 25 and 26. O Lord, save us. O Lord, grant us success. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. From the house of the Lord we bless you. Perhaps I should point out that the Hebrew in verse 25 renders in English as Lord, save us. The Hebrew is Hosanna. Back to our chapter in Mark 11, verses 9 and 10. It seems that what's going on here is that the people are singing Psalm 118, but improvising some changes to the wording in order to apply it to Jesus. And the most obvious change is that instead of welcoming the coming of the king, they praised the coming of the kingdom. That's very likely to mean that they knew Jesus was always talking about the new kingdom of God, and they assumed that his entering Jerusalem was a key event in the arrival of that kingdom. So that's the triumphant approach. Verse 11 is then the entry. Notice that in verse 11 there's no commentary here of any continuation of the triumphant procession. It's usually reckoned that Jericho was about a day's walk from Jerusalem, so it's possible that Jesus and the others had done it in a day, but the day would be nearly over by the time they got to the city. So it's entirely reasonable that Jesus had a quick look round the temple courts and then went back to Bethany, to what was his base for the week. It could well have been Martha and Mary who put them up. Technically, in the Jewish regulations, Bethany was regarded as just outside the limits of the city of Jerusalem, but it was obviously good for Jesus and the 12 to stay with friends. Come Thursday evening, they would no longer go out to Bethany, because the Passover regulations required that pilgrims should spend the night within the bounds of the city, and Bethany was, as I say, just outside. That's why for that night people would be kipping all over the city, and Jesus led his men to the Garden of Gethsemane, seemingly so that they could spend a night there. This despite the fact that the Last Supper was held a day early, but more of that later. I need to start all over again. And on this occasion, we're going to go further into the story. We're going to go um, through to verse 19. Verses 12 to 14. As they were going back into the city the next morning, Jesus spotted a fig tree which had plenty of leaves but no fruit. Jesus then uttered a curse on the tree because it was not bearing any fruit. Mark tells us that it wasn't the right time of year for ripe figs to be on the tree, so Jesus' action is strange. Was he in some way blaming the tree for not bearing fruit? If so, he was being very unreasonable. We'll leave the incident there and return to it when Mark does. Before we look at what happened in the temple, I need to read you a sermon. It's from Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 1 to 15 and then verse 20. I'll read it to you. Stand at the gate of the Lord's house, and there proclaim this message. Hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah who come through these gates to worship the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this house. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave to your forefathers forever and ever. But look, you are trusting in deceptive words that are worthless. Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods you've not known, and then come and stand before me in this house which bears my name, and say, We are safe to do all these detestable things? Has this house which bears my name become a den of robbers to you? But I've been watching, declares the Lord. Go now to the place in Shiloh where I first made a dwelling for my name, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel. While you were doing all these things, declares the Lord, I spoke to you again and again, but you did not listen. I called you, but you did not answer. Therefore, what I did to Shiloh, I will now do to the house that bears my name, the temple you trust in, the place I gave you and your fathers. I will trust you from my presence, just as I did all your brothers. I will thrust you out. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. My anger and my wrath will be poured out on this place, on man and beast, on the trees of the field and the fruit of the ground, and it will burn and not be quenched. Whew. That was Jeremiah preaching at the entrance of the Jerusalem temple, something like 5 centuries before Jesus. It was a high-profile action which would have remained in the people's memory even many generations later. What Jesus did there will have made people think back to Jeremiah. Verse 15. Jesus had in effect proclaimed that he was Messiah by the way that he rode up to Jerusalem on a donkey. Now he sets about acting like he was in charge and showing his objection to the way that the temple courts were managed. It's pretty certain that the events took place in the court of the Gentiles, the large outer court, which was the only part of the complex to which Gentiles were admitted. Most of the people there, however, would have been Jews. There are 2 pieces of background that you need. The first is that this was the time of the year when all Jews had to pay their half-shekel temple tax. The temple wouldn't accept the tax in any other currency, so the people had to change their money into shekels in order to pay it. That money changing could only be done through the official money changers who had their tables in this large court. It was only at this time of the year that the money changers were there, only when the temple tax was due. But at other times of the year, the people were supposed to bring their animals to the priests for sacrifice. The majority of the people were poor, and their sacrifices consisted largely of pigeons. Those who were better off would sometimes offer a sheep or a goat. Now, the regulations required that these animals should be perfect. That meant that some official had to examine each animal and declare that it was perfect, a bit like getting your dog into the relevant breed competition at Crufts. But the people knew that if they bought their animal from one of the official sellers, it would then go through on the nod. And that's why the stalls for the pigeons were set up right there in the temple court. Those selling the larger animals set up stalls just out on the Mount of Olives, just outside the city. Well, Jesus clearly thought that all this trade was a disastrous misuse of the temple courts. So he set about overturning the trading tables and driving the traders out of the court. It's hardly possible that Jesus managed to get them all out, so we ought to regard what he was doing as making a point. It was a point in part about the spiritual poverty of the temple, and partly, of course, about his own right as Messiah to say what should happen there. Verse 16. It looks as if other traders were carrying their merchandise through the court as well, and they came in for the same treatment from Jesus. Verse 17. In Isaiah 56 is a grand prophecy looking forward to the time when the nations will flock to Jerusalem in order to approach Israel's God. And when that happens, the temple will function gloriously as a house of prayer for all nations. That's Isaiah 56, verse 7. Jesus gives his own action backing by quoting that prophecy. He also recalls what Jeremiah had preached on that very spot. Jeremiah had said that his fellow countrymen were little more than thieves and robbers, and that despite that they turned up religiously at the temple and expected their God to receive their worship there. Living as they did, that was an insult to their God, and Jesus reminds the people around him of what Jeremiah had said. If you read what Jesus said and have not done your homework in Jeremiah, you might think that the thieves and robbers bit referred to unfair trading going on in that court. It's more than possible that there was abuse of the traders' monopoly position, and that would have been the usual business of defrauding the poor who made up the majority of the buyers in the court. But in view of what Jeremiah had said, it looks as if Jesus was objecting as much to what those traders did outside of the temple as to what it was that was going on in the court. Verse 18. Back in Mark 3, verse 6, the Pharisees, together with the Herodians, had already decided that they had to get Jesus killed. That was while he was still up in Galilee, and those Pharisees were the main advocates of the traditional religion. Now that Jesus was in Jerusalem, literally within the temple which was administered by the chief priests, it was those chief priests who became his chief opponents. In view of what Jesus had just done, they came to the conclusion that the same conclusion that the Pharisees had come to, that Jesus had to be killed. But it wouldn't be easy. All the pilgrims who filled the city and who almost certainly made up the majority of people in the temple court, well, most of them at any rate, were keen supporters of Jesus. Even when Jesus was doing something against the system, many of those people would have been in favor of it. The chief priests, like the Pharisees, could be a right pain to the ordinary people, and seeing them get one in the eye from Jesus would be quite popular. So the chief priests knew that they had to box clever. There was, for instance, no question of sending the temple soldiers in to arrest Jesus there and then. With the Passover crowds there, that would have started a riot. And that difficulty explains why Jesus was able to get out of there and return to Bethany for the night, despite the fact that Jesus has already seriously offended the chief priests. We're in the middle of a story here, and we're stopping in the middle of a story to resume it on another occasion. God bless you.